Hello again, friends. My name is Rob Womack, and I'm the author of this little book, Jubilee, the Emancipation of Life and Love. And today I would like to read to you the third chapter in this book. It opens with an epigraph by Rabbi Marcia Prager from her book, The Path of Blessing, Experiencing the Energy and Abundance of the Divine. Humility is knowing oneself as integral to a larger whole, a shimmering thread in a great web. When I fully grasp that I am part of all that is, part of life, part of the mystery, walls of separation break down. I feel whole and complete. I am part of the dance of life and God, and I know that my soul has its particular role, which no other soul can fill. I feel my true nature as a sacred being in a sacred universe. I recognize that you too are sacred. This recognition leads me to ask, what is your story? What is your soul's journey about? Chapter 3, Harvesters of Sun. We have come to the beginning of the final day of the 99th increment of time. Pause for a moment and notice what arises within you at its mention. Excitement for a new beginning, anticipation of the centennial ahead, or fear and dread of an imminent finality. What do the feelings reflect about the predictions made? What do the predictions reflect about the maps in the mind? Trust in this assurance. All is well. No need to worry. We are still far from the lived experience of our final destination. While you read these words, you are here, you are safe, you are loved. This too is a fundamental principle echoing throughout the universe. A day to the universe is not like one to us, nor are the notions of finality, fear, or dread. Indeed, as we will soon see, steadfast continuity flows easily, even in the change to fractional units of minutes or hours or days. Early in the final week of the final month of this 99th increment, our oldest parent, those primates with an unusual gait, became numerous enough and distinct enough to be separated from their kin. Yesterday, Homo erectus died. As a harbinger of their offspring's resiliency, the brevity of Erectus's life could be easily overlooked. No single event does a pattern make. However, if the outcomes of our closest relatives were taken as a whole, there is ample reason to be more gravely concerned. None have lived long. In fact, only one still lives today. Our youngest parent, Homo sapiens, emerged a few hours after midnight on this, the very last day. Orphaned in infancy, sapiens were late to notice that no one else like them remained. As all beings before, from the original seed to cyanode to sapiens, emergence was followed by rest. Sapiens' Sabbath, like their age, was terribly brief and quick. In the late afternoon, as the sun began its descent, their Sabbath followed suit. The hours of accomplishment since have been a true astonishment. Breathtaking, mind-boggling, jaw-dropping, to say the least. Infancy to adolescence to adulthood careened at a breakneck pace. During the Sabbath, sapiens roamed far and wide. They soon came to realize that the unnamed planet, like their bodies, was mostly aquatic. Several expansive landmasses were tenuously joined by bridges just beneath the coursing seas. When the moon was hidden, as the seas slept, a single star could guide them. In small boats, sapiens crossed over. Land provided sanctuaries of refuge, but as in all such spaces, There were no guarantees. Upon the great islands, sapiens noticed numerous beings shared this home. Some had 2 legs, some had 4, some had no legs at all. Those constrained to the land lived within a 3-dimensional space. In 2 dimensions, bound by gravity, they moved from horizon to horizon on a level plane. In the 3rd, upon a planet spinning through space. They meandered, foraging for food, places to rest, and others with whom to play. If their neighbors took note of sapiens, they were pleasant and friendly. Most, however, seemed too occupied with caring for each other to spare sapiens any attention. Sapiens noticed other, more magnificent neighbors had a much greater range. These could move in all directions within a 4-dimensional space. Like their time-bound, landlocked neighbors, they could move between the horizons upon the spinning planet. Furthermore, with wings they elevated far into the skies. With fins they could descend deep into the seas. They traveled in the 6 directions essentially as they pleased. Greatly enhanced were their abilities to seek food, safe shelter, and delight in expressive play. Poor sapiens could only stare in awe at their flights of fancy. Though sapiens had no numbers as of yet with which to count, their neighbors, hidden by the seas and sheltered among the trees, far outnumbered them. If this aquatic planet with its enormous skies and islands of land belonged to anyone, certainly it was to those more numerous than sapiens. Like a visiting stranger, it seemed sapiens had been extended a solemn invitation. If accepted, they could share in this space, this sliver in time, with their elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin. If sapiens cared for the land, air, and water as if it were home, their presence would be welcomed. If they chose otherwise, as to where they may go, finding out would come the hard way. Outcomes remain undisclosed. Branches pruned or cast deep into an abyss of non-memory. Upon the land there was one with neither wings nor fins nor legs who impressed sapiens more than all others. Humbly rooted to the soil, less perceptive observers might overlook this elder's great importance. They weathered stormy winds with strength and flexibility. Joined root to root, they firmly anchored each other to the soil. The underground matrix wordlessly conveyed information crucial to their health. Joined from branch to root by rippled bark, precious rain was channeled downward. Then from root to branch, nutrified water flowed up through inner capillaries. Year after year, green leaves unfurled to gather the sun's energy. With little assistance, they prospered through acts of generosity and simplicity. The rooted ones were so efficient in their work, a surplus was freely shared. The beings who stayed close to the land were very well fed. Those who moved aloft found shelter, safety, and rest. Shade was spread as a respite for every passerby. With subtle respirations, they cleansed the atmosphere. Throughout the year, their leaves, stems, roots, and seeds provided medicine for ailing neighbors. In moments of spontaneity, beneath the illuminating sun or the mysterious moon, leaves shimmied as bodies swayed. With wind, they danced and played. It seemed to sapiens that every being, those with roots, fins, and wings, on 2 legs and on 4, and with no legs at all had a purpose to fulfill. Even death and its sidekick, decay. In the sequence of events, they performed their roles like naturals. At times, death appeared suddenly. Storms still descended upon the planet with incredible force. At other times, a passerby may unknowingly trespass and transition into newfound prey. The material and energy of life could be instantly washed away. Alas, if sapiens intruded upon the space of a neighbor, their approach too quick, too close, or both simultaneously, a hard lesson was learned. Like a tuning fork, the memory reverberated to the third and fourth generations. Everyone was free to move and to occupy their own space. No one was needlessly killed nor permanently displaced. Occasionally, death came more slowly. Illness and injury were experienced universally. Illness might inhabit vulnerable bodies, and the animating energy gradually fade, at times within the arc of a single day. At others, death's approach, when rain was sparse or winter bitter, could be spied from a season away. Suffering, however, was completely unknown. Likewise, betrayal and abandonment, not a mere coincidence. Hardships were never endured alone. To the elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin, sapiens among them, the cycle of death, birth, and life was a sacred process. On occasions when one's vitality steadily faded and friends came to love them at the bedside, the transition was gratefully accepted as a blessing undisguised. Life and love was ever present. Long exhalations only succumbed to yet another deep inhale. Good place for a sip of coffee. When Neanderthalensis, the last of our parents' siblings, suddenly reached the end of their brief life, they gave to our youngest parent, Sapiens, an astounding skill and gift. The elder taught the younger how to draw. The contribution to memory and abstract thought has ramified profoundly ever since. With the development of vocal language, Erectus had learned to represent objects and events symbolically. When combined with the gift of visual drawing, their offspring learned how to record and preserve memories of experience. Knowledge could now be transmitted extrinsically across the space of villages and the time of generations. Exemplary demonstration was no longer the sole method by which to teach, nor observation to learn. Knowledge converted into images of experiences, ideas, and beliefs could be preserved and passed along. If later generations retained a literacy of attention and interpretation, wisdom need not be suddenly lost nor fade away. From that day onward, generations could find a way home if corrupted ancestors strayed. Once sapiens understood the value of sharing truthful information, there came the time for sound education. Elders and children, teachers and students encircled the communal fire. In the exchange, students as questioners led. They described the day's experiences of confusion and surprise, internal sensations they could now notice, distinguish, and identify. The questioners sensed within them that a prediction had been made, yet somehow expectations turned out differently. They wondered, how or why did it occur in this particular way? Their curiosity kindled, a field opened wide for stationary explorations of space, memory, spirit, and mind. Then teachers took their turn, for neither did they know. More questions were forthcoming. They too must learn. To comprehend what had happened, the context must be thoroughly described. What did the questioners observe? What did they see, hear, smell, taste, and feel, inside and out? The skin, gut, heart, and face were all sources of valuable information, as were the eyes, ears, nose, and tongue. Teachers listened closely, then a final set of questions. What had happened just before? What earlier events had formed their predictions, the pattern of memories from which today's events diverged? Then, in closing, the teachers would ask, what did you believe would happen next? Everyone listening understood. Nothing of the future could be known, only imagined, in hopes that it might appear in familiar robes. Automatic predictions were based on beliefs and patterns of past events, if any such patterns had been previously experienced, that is. Beliefs were little more than ephemeral thoughts generated within the nascent mind. The more rigid the prediction or belief, the greater the surprise. Indeed, knowledge, whether memory or imagination, is forever incomplete. Certainty is but a cunning deception, belief a clever ploy around which perceptions accrete. Tangentially related, one would hope, to a physical reality actually experienced, but such is never guaranteed. In any event, comprehension of past and present, like predictions of the future, is inherently limited. As shadow and light flickered, the teachers paused, first to listen, then to breathe. The full context must be absorbed, including the perspective of each participant. Before a word of wisdom can be offered, the aperture of heart and mind patiently softens, then dilates to full openness. Another moment for a cup of coffee. A sip. Whereas the students described what had happened, it was left to the teachers to attempt an explanation as to how or why. When done well, subjective explanations could shade in the opaque space between memory and predictions, between uncertainty and surprise. Each novel and dissonant experience contributed to an emergent pattern. The mosaic of broken pieces was enfolded in a larger whole. Within degrees of uncertainty, the next piece might be reasonably predicted, but the future was interminably undetermined. In other words, whereas the past is partially comprehensible, the future is completely unknown. This is what the teachers taught, and what the students were meant to learn. Patient discovery leads to understanding. When taken as a whole, consonance can reconcile dissonance, if both are allowed to enter the open aperture of one's heart and mind. Attempts at subjective explanations fell solely to the teachers, but for one reason alone. On one hand, it was true, the creation of the minds of the teachers had been in process for an equally long period of time, equal with all elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin, including sapiens. On the other hand, teachers held a slight advantage over questioners. From the sunrise of their birth to this most recent minute, within the flow of web of life and love, they had been exquisitely attentive witnesses. Therefore, the mental maps they carried were generally more broad, more detailed in particularity, and oftentimes both simultaneously. The advantages brought awareness, later called humility. Knowledge was a process, emergent and forever incomplete. The roles of teachers and questioners alternated in a seamless ebb and flow. Teachers continued to experience curiosity, perplexed confusion, and bright-eyed surprise. They too were students for life. The questioner's slight disadvantage, however, could never be completely overcome. Thus it was the teacher's responsibility to emulate wisdom, humility, empathy, and compassion, with demonstrations that words were hamstrung to convey. With open hearts and open minds, they were rarely angry or shocked, alert but never afraid. To the best of their ability, they cared well for others during work, rest, laughter, and play. When the campfire had smoldered into a warm, soft glow, the teachers and questioners slept. The planet's shadow cast a darkness over the land for a spell of nightly peacefulness. Then, as had happened for as long as sapiens could recall, once more the sun arose. As birds sang their ode to the morning, a host of elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin were likewise beckoned to arise. A new day of effortless work, to flow, to teach, to care, had arrived. Afterwards, like clockwork, came the time to play. Each day's routine was regularly the same. A stable, predictable frame offered the widest range for creative acts of love and beauty. Once again, a paradox. In preparation for the tasks of the day ahead, elders gathered the children to bring along. Those too small to walk were carried aloft. From their perch, like a lantern or lighthouse, they could observe. With eyes and ears like sponges, everything was absorbed. Nothing was overlooked. Neither a tittle nor a yod, not one iota was tossed. Though far too young to translate memories into symbolic language, children retained each drop seen, felt, and experienced. Interactions between the elders were overheard, sequences of tasks observed, particular outcomes, purposes achieved, without a word came to be easily understood. If, simultaneously, an inner emotion was evoked, such as joy, shame, sadness, or fear, even longer did the new memory adhere, for better or for worse, that is. With children astride, the parents roamed. To satisfy their metabolic need for the sun, the fruit of the vine was gathered. To satisfy fire's ravenous hunger, cords of wood, dried wood were stacked. For the ill and injured sheltered at home, fingers gingerly collected medicinal leaves, stems, and roots. Small amounts were taken. Much more for later was left in place. Information, too, was gathered from neighbors. Equal in importance to food, wood, and medicine, truthful information aided preparations for the cycles known as the future, next season, and tomorrow. Along the way, sapiens might also find soft materials to protect fragile but resilient bodies in motion. Coarse materials as well for the shelters where sapiens slept and the places where the tools were kept. Once assembled, materials coarse and soft protected the flesh and the beings inside from excessive sun, wind, cold, and rain, as well as the objects which supported life. During these expeditions, no child was left behind. Parents were not separated from their children. From sunrise to sunrise, the care and education of children was always first and foremost in Sapiens' mind. Even before short legs stood them upright, children were carried along to watch and to learn. In the earliest seasons, before the children developed a capacity to assess safety, risk, and sound decisions, they were always kept close by. At first within arm's reach, later within reach of the eyes. As the children's maps broadened and new perspectives were sought, children could venture beyond the parents' sight, but stayed always within earshot. As their legs gained in strength and coordination, children explored independently. From varied perspectives, new skills were learned. As their arms, hands, and fingers became more nimble, children were asked to assist. The elders' work was practiced firsthand. Sequences were enacted, adequate force applied. A subtlety of touch came of age in fingers, spirits, and mind. When released from the parents' full attention, children sought opportunities to craft mental maps of their own. Far could they roam, but they did not stray. They had no reason to hide or to lie. A return to safety was always easy to find. In the mind's eye, patterns converged. Children gained in curiosity and took small risks. Their confidence multiplied. At the beginning of the final hour of the final day of the 99th increment of time, as with the domestication of fire, another second-order change occurred. While sapiens roamed to find morsels of food, they made a fascinating observation. When overripe fruit released from the vine, it fell to impregnate the soil. Later, in the very same spot, a miniature replica of the robust parent emerged. In due time, the little ones matured and bore fruit of their own. Due to consistent consumption of the sun's energy from the fruit of the vine and the burning of the brush, Sapiens was enabled to conceive of yet another new idea. In handfuls they gathered seeds from overripe fruit. Like wind, they carried the seeds closer to home. Like gravity, they delicately laid them in rows. Then they gently covered them with soil. As the tender sprouts emerged, Sapiens drizzled water around the tiny stalk and nurtured them as if they were one of their own. Later in the season, following life and love's instructions, the plentiful attention was returned. The sprouts yielded fruit for all to share and consume. Figs, the most delectable of fruits, were the first agricultural experiment. Sapiens patiently cared for the young sprouts. Before bearing fruit, young fig trees made 3, 4, then 5 trips around the sun. Patience was worthwhile. When the time was ripe, figs were a delicacy to behold. Sapiens also understood, much to their chagrin, that for healthy muscles, teeth, and bones, such succulence would not suffice. Thus they planted hardy grasses like barley and rye for the abundant grains of seed, as well as more versatile fruits of pistachio and olive trees. By experimentation, sapiens learned and practiced the art of agriculture. When sapiens who gathered the sun were well cared for and nurtured, energy stored could be harvested and shared. Energy, care, and good health endlessly cycled from plant to body to plant. Longevity followed its optimum with consistent reciprocity. With the newfound ability to domesticate the sun, less time was spent searching and gathering. More was freed for play and creativity. Imagination conjured up a cornucopia of ideas. Sapiens suddenly became more literate in the language of the universe. Consciousness expanded. Later, consciousness gave itself a name, spirit. Then came a nickname, more intimate and familiar, intuition. As a result, new medicines in leaves, stems, and roots were discovered. Tools of all varieties improved. Shelters and structures were redesigned and built of sturdier materials. Seasons gave fewer reasons for anxious migrations en masse. No one went hungry. No one grew cold. The ill were more often cured. Those who were not did not die alone. Sapiens lived long, as did their neighbors. In numbers, their villages grew. After the advent of agriculture and the expansive growth in population, a significant problem arose. If sapiens continued to work in traditional ways, the needs of the community could not be sustained. Sapiens could no longer work in large groups to perform one task at a time. Generalists heretofore, sapiens had to begin to divide their labor and specialize in unique roles. Smaller groups would now perform tasks sequentially so multiple families could be served simultaneously. Each person within the small groups would be trusted to fulfill their niche responsibly. As is so often the case, with greater specialization came ever more interdependence. A systematic method would be necessary to organize and coordinate these specialties of care. A bivocational role was devised to help guide the emergent system. The new role was given a title, Steward Manager. While steward managers continued to work within the small groups to serve their neighbors directly, time was allotted to new types of decisions. Steward managers were the integument between the community of elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin, including sapiens. They addressed any disharmony between the interdependent beings, equal in all ways, but in relationship one step removed. The steward managers were selected because they had the foresight to perceive a budding phenomenon. Long before the category known as prisoner was invented, they were aware of the prisoner's dilemma. Two beings separated and unable to communicate occasionally must make decisions which affect the outcomes of others. Lacking prior knowledge or communicated coordination, each individual was likely to default to choices which brought them the most benefit, the least harm, or both. In such situations, the anonymous others should fend for themselves, or so the thinking went. Outcomes, as one can easily guess, were consistently less than optimal. However, if decisions could be coordinated, interdependent beings would benefit more and lose less. Therefore, before difficult decisions with incomplete information had to be made, participants learned the ways to act for the common good. Instructed in the needs of community, they mutually agreed to methods which generated the greatest benefit and the least harm for everyone. Cooperation was favored over competition, reciprocity over self-interest. Since the instructions were widely known and agreed upon, direct communication to coordinate care was rarely necessary. Third-party interventions as well. The steward managers grew bored. Synchronous acts of care were more often coordinated silently by the instructions resonating throughout the web of life and love. In the verbose future, such coordination would be ascribed the names of trust and unity. In extraordinary situations lacking good communication and prior agreements, as mentioned above, individuals might devolve to rely on narrow self-interest. The results, again, were less than optimal. As results rippled outward, the community as a whole suffered through the unfolding losses. Therefore, as these situations arose, a trustworthy intermediary was quite helpful. This was the narrowly defined part-time role of the steward manager, to assist with caring, cooperative interactions of those in extraordinary situations who could not directly communicate. And so it was that governance emerged. Steward managers and sapiens realized that good governance was more art than science. Guided by principle and process, rarely for a particular outcome, the coordination of care was relational. Those skilled in good governance acted with humility to mimic the processes of life and love. They kept a wide perspective of the needs of the air, soil, and water, as well as the elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin, interdependent upon each other. The consenting community agreed to abide by the steward manager's minimal decisions, to yield to a wider perspective, opened by the states of mind later called kindness and reciprocity. To respond creatively to the unpredictable complexities of life, good governance maintained simplicity. Thus it was constituted of a mere three categories of rules. The first, that which was required, and the second, that which was forbidden, were stated explicitly. Everything else left unsaid was implicitly permitted. A small number of acts were required of everyone. These acts to care for elders, neighbors, siblings, and kin elicited fundamental forms of beneficence. If not consistently performed, the security of predictability for the purpose of creative exploration and the perpetuation of the multicellular community would unravel. To state this more succinctly, without beneficence, continuity in the midst of change disintegrates towards disorder. The second category, even smaller than the first, was comprised of the forbidden acts of maleficence. Such acts were intuitively known to be harmful. If enacted, illness, injury, or death were sure to follow. The list was short because the reigning presumption throughout the community was that each and every one wished to avoid causing harm. Unless deviations from the instructions of life and love were repeated, an explicit list of forbidden acts seemed redundant and unnecessary. The third category, by far the largest, comprised all acts permitted. Some options permitted were much better than others. These were generally preferred. However, some acts permitted were not in and of themselves considered good. These were generally avoided. Freedom of choice, by definition, allowed for the widest range of the window of tolerance. Personal responsibility, mutual trust, and consideration of the common good allowed sapiens to live well within the window and would deprive later tyrannies of their all-consuming energy. The flexibility of a wide range of permitted acts eased constraints to creatively, cooperatively address unpredictability. The range also made room for friendly competition. Two or more groups could experiment within the ethical limits of homeostasis and discover a multiplicity of new and better ways to flourish. Compliance with acts explicitly required and forbidden was managed with minimal enforcement. With collective consent for the common good and widespread personal integrity, overseers were unnecessary. Use of force was never permitted. Fear of violence and humiliation, the preferred means of control and domination, were completely unheard of. Such practices were only later adopted during a brief era of severe systemic inefficiency. At the time, however, first mistakes were largely accepted because, on occasion, good choices can be difficult to predict, even more so to implement. When a poor choice was realized, a correction was voluntarily attempted by the one who was mistaken. Acknowledgement, apology, reparations, and a commitment to better future decisions were among the norms of the community. If commitments were not upheld, appropriate sanctions were determined by the community at large, including those who struggled to conform. Sanctions served like a shepherd's rod and staff. Before a member of the community strayed from the fold, a firm belief in the sanction's equal application discouraged wayward decisions. However, if a poor decision was repeated, the sanction was unequivocal. For instance, if an act which was required was repeatedly ignored, the neglectful one was undoubtedly immersed in opportunities to observe and participate in its benefits. On the other hand, if one persisted in acts which were forbidden, the abusive one was withdrawn from further opportunities to cause harm. During the period of their sequester, they were assisted in learning the ways of beneficence. Time and materials were provided to repair the prior damage done. Once restored to a healthy baseline of peaceful contentment, the one sequestered was slowly released. A process of integration within the community was accomplished by demonstrations of generous care and self-restraint. If a rule, either forbidden or required, was regularly violated by multiple sapiens, the rule was first scrutinized rather than the violators. Such evaluation was meant to discover if the rule had reached its expiration. If a rule was no longer honored, was the act widely considered permissible? Had the rule become superfluous? If so, the rule was deleted from the explicit lists of acts required and forbidden. The window of tolerance widened. For an act to move in the opposite direction, no longer implicitly permitted and so added to lists of required or forbidden, was a much steeper climb. The needs of the community and the beings of whom it was composed were prioritized over onerous rules and the privileges and power they imparted. Good governance and its clearly delimited constitution were designed to preserve inclusion in the community, freedom of movement, an even distribution of labor, and the meeting of everyone's needs. In spite of the best efforts of the steward managers, due to specialized divisions in the distribution of labor, stresses did emerge. The synchronicity of trade fell out of rhythm. The farmer, for example, worked every day, so neighbors had food adequate for 1,000 meals to circumnavigate the sun. The carpenter, by contrast, in the same length of time, could build only one home. Then the family who dwelt inside had no additional need for many cycles to come. The tailor worked but a few days on clothing which protected a body for a season. The healer was always at the ready, but when they would be needed was irregular and unpredictable. As a result, barter was no longer equitable. As often as the farmer fed the carpenter, there was no need for a new home. The healer changed clothes more often than the tailor fell ill. The prescient steward managers realized a new tool was soon to come, a symbolic placeholder to note that one being had served another, but the provider was not yet in need. Furthermore, as specialization, distance, and density cast a wider shade of anonymity, a new method was also needed to communicate information wordlessly. Recipients in remote exchanges desired a means to express their appreciation. Here's a quote. "Thank you for supplying these. I needed this instead of that. In the future, I hope you can do more of the same." Close quote. Therefore, the steward managers deployed a new tool called money. It served as a placeholder to smooth the asynchronicity of commercial trade. It was also a means to communicate gratitude to neighbors noticed yet unseen. Money was a stunning innovation, previously unimagined. Sapiens was the first, and still the only, to use anything of its kind. The idea was so unique, there were no models to emulate. Out of thin air, instructions for its use had to be invented. The first instruction stated that to briefly hold money was permitted, but its accumulation was forbidden. Money functioned only while in motion. Once it stopped, someone, somewhere, went without. Therefore, the first instruction implied the second. Everyone agreed to receive a minimum compensation for their efforts. A smaller amount was more easily passed along and less likely to accumulate. Chances were reduced that some specialties might acquire an excess which lingered uselessly while others were deprived. The third instruction dovetailed nicely with the two above. Provision of care was not contingent upon the amount of money on hand. If a neighbor had a need, the provider was obliged to provide. As a matter of reciprocity, neighbors requested only the minimum. No one could be denied their needs for any reason, neither age nor ability nor poverty. Indeed, poverty as a concept was unimaginable. Wealth as well, not a mere coincidence. May those with ears hear. If an excess began to accumulate, expedient redistribution was required. Surpluses were voluntarily relinquished to the community at large or neighbors in need. Otherwise, future troubles were easily foreseen. As stated above, if money accumulated in one home, in another there was a dearth. Out of pity or compassion, the one with too much might lend to the one who had too little, but the lender would someday insist upon the money's return. To avoid conflicts, the borrower would then feel compelled to strive for an excess. Their present expenses would still have to be met, and, in addition, the unmet needs of yesterday. A corrupted wisdom would therefore lead to an errant belief. To avoid similar situations in the future, every opportunity to hoard money should be seized. Such acts signaled a dire systemic inefficiency. It was akin to water held behind a leaky dam or a heavy snowpack in spring. In the downstream path of destruction, the entire community. To avoid such a calamity, these simple instructions put specialties in labor and money to good use. And here are 4 bullet points. In your service, care, and work, give to the best of your ability, neither more nor less. Refuse no one their needs for material, energy, information, or work, so as not to overburden neighbors. When seeking one's needs, limit yourself to a full and complete minimum. Allow money to flow. Do not clutch or cling, and sow the seeds of its accumulation. With conditions in the community mutually agreed, it should come as no surprise that money was a useful tool for quite a long time. Unfortunately, as you may have guessed, sapiens' use of money became badly distorted. The corruption was experienced universally, but the consequences were dealt unevenly. With this in mind, we cautiously approach sapiens' very recent downfall. And so concludes the 3rd chapter. Thank you for being here and listening. I look forward to reading chapter 4 to you very soon.